least you don't remember the fine points. It's also been called the story of the forgiving father, which is really probably a better title. The story itself is the primary story of salvation. And I think it was Jesus' understanding of the meaning of salvation. Everything about the human journey of being estranged, being awakened, and being received just as you are can be pulled through this story. Okay? It's all there. It has nothing to do with going to heaven when you die. Jesus doesn't seem to be concerned about that. In fact, he doesn't seem to know anything about a Son of God having to die in order for us to be reconciled to an angry God. The story is about being lost here and now in this present life. It's about being separated from that which we are, whether we leave home as the younger son did, or whether we're still at home as the older brother was. There are three characters in the story. Everybody remembers it, of course. The father and the two sons. But it's a story about every human being. If you can think about it that way, you can grasp it as a story about you and me. The Father represents God not as being out there somewhere separate from us. The Father represents the Christ in you, your own permanent home, your own true nature that you can return to and you can come back to. The younger son represents that of you which is sensual and worldly and materialistic. Sometimes we've called it the dark side. Think about this, though, in terms of the human journey. We were all born whole, and let us hope that we will die whole. But somewhere early on the way, we eat one of the wonderful fruits of the tree of knowledge and of good and evil, and we begin the shadow-making process. We divide our lives. Now, this is necessary. There would be no civilized world without the division between good and evil. This is the process of separating ourselves from our true whole self, from others, and from the ground of our being. Thomas Keating, the Centering Prayer Guru, says that this is caused by the urgent need to escape from the profound insecurity of the human situation. And it gives rise, when unchecked, to insatiable desires for pleasure, possession, and power. The younger son is lured out into the far country, for that's where he thinks the action is. He is deluded into thinking that this is the way to find where life is, to have the most sensual experiences of life. The prodigal sets out to be free and ends up enslaved. He seeks to gain life and loses it. Out of his own egocentric nature, he leaves home to feast and ends up famished. He leaves home to be married and ends up miserable. He gets sick of home, only to end up in the throes of homesickness. This, my friends, is the essential pain of the human condition. This represents that of you which is ego-centered, sensation-centered, material-centered. In time, the prodigal is stripped of his own sense of self-worth and meaning in life. He's cut off from his true nature in God. He's reduced to feeding hogs for a living. This represents life at its lowest ebb. For us, this could mean the failure to perform successfully in society, or it could be the experience of great success and affluence with a total lack of meaning. It's been called soul sickness. Every person goes through this prodigal stage at some time or another. I figure I've been through this about 3 or 4 times in my life. This is necessary, it seems like, in our personal growth. Perhaps we have to go into that far country so that we can grow back into the consciousness of our true oneness. Perhaps we have to know our separation before we can experience unity. The parable says in the story at some point, he came to himself. I just love that phrase. He came to himself. He became somewhat conscious of his true identity. The theologian Paul Tillich, as I've told you many times, has called this the experience of being struck by grace that sometimes happens to us in the midst of our greatest separation. Tillich says, sometimes at the moment of your greatest separation, a wave of light comes on in your darkness. Listen to those metaphors. A wave of light comes on in your darkness. And it is as though a voice were heard to say, you are accepted just as you are by that which is greater than you. He came to himself. Now, this does not mean that your situation has changed. He's still feeding hogs, right? But, and your marriage may still be a mess. But, the way you now relate to your situation is totally transformed. This is an important turning point. For we must admit that we've made a mistake and that we're going in the wrong direction. Note that in the story, the father stands unmoved through all of this, symbolizing the stability and the ever availability of the ground of our being. If the father had compelled the son to stay at home or to come home when he got in trouble, he would never have been able to come to himself. He would always have been a prodigal at heart. Only when the father left him alone was he able to come to himself in the midst of his misery. Only then was a homecoming possible. Only then could he have had the experience of being received just as he was. He had to hurt. And we have to hurt for a good bit of time before we end up in the pigsty of awakening. I love that phrase too. The pigsty of awakening. Don't you love that? When the prodigal decided to go home, he rehearsed a little speech that he would give to his father. Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants. So the prodigal arrives home. The time lapse could have been 40 minutes, or it could have been 4 years, or it could have been 40 years. How long the journey takes is irrelevant, okay? He's given the symbols of his recovered divine essence. Shoes, rings, the best robe. In other words, yes, you are worthy to be my son. No matter what you have done, you are worthy. You are a valuable, worthwhile, loving human being. That's who you are in God. This is the unconventional wisdom of this kind of salvation that shatters all of our conventional wisdom about the way life is. The prodigal comes home wanting scraps of bread that fall from the servant's table, only to be given a banquet. He comes home expecting the worst, and he receives the best. Now the older brother has stayed home to work faithfully and dutifully in the father's fields. He's not too happy about the treatment received by his younger brother. After all, he reasons jealously. He did not recklessly spend his inheritance, and the father has never given him a party. He represents the conforming part of our consciousness, which does not break away to seek freedom and worldly experiences, but which is nevertheless in bondage to obligation and secretly resents it. It's its own dark side. You get it? By his jealousy, he indicates that he's a prodigal at heart and probably secretly longed to do what his younger brother had done, but didn't have the courage. Behind the facade of respectability, there's bitterness and cynicism. Through all the years, he's faithfully served the Father, and he secretly resented it. Now that the younger son has come to himself, the older son will have to have his own transformation. He has traded his personal transformation for the cultural belonging system of which he was a part. Thomas Merton says in one of his books that the greatest tragedy of our age is the fact that there's so many godless Christians. Christians whose religion is a matter of pure conformity and expedience. Does that sound like the older son? Does that sound like you and me? The older brother will have to have his own eyes opened and drop his conformist slave mentality. The father speaks words of acceptance to him. Son, you are always with me, and all that I have is yours. God is always present, no matter what our partial experience may be. Whether you're experiencing the lack and meaninglessness of your own far country, or whether you're allowing your devotion to become ritualistic, mechanical, and self-righteous, the divine in you, your own Christ-like, Christ-life potential, stands ready as your help in every need. Then, my friends, the final stage of the spiritual life is to embrace the possibility that we are the Father in the story. Our final vocation is to become like the Father and to live out this divine compassion in our daily life. though I'm both the younger son and the elder son, mostly elder son these days, I'm not to remain there. I'm to become the father, the mother. That's the perennial wisdom. My perennialist view is that the sole purpose of your life and my life is to realize that we are God. The word Jesus uses most often to identify God was compassionate. He said, you are to be compassionate as your heavenly Father is compassionate. So the first element of moving toward wholeness has to do with birth in the Spirit. This involves that dying to the self, which is represented in the story of the prodigal coming to himself and coming home. The second core element of life in the Spirit is being and living compassionately. After I've experienced being received just as I am by that which is greater than me, then I'm destined to step into the Father's place and to offer to others the same compassion that has been offered to me. The return to the Father ultimately is the challenge to become the Father. To return to the wholeness that we are is ultimately the challenge to become the whole making one. We're continually called to come home, to come to the party, to join in the general dance. For us, as for the prodigal, to come home means to return to the one who is the nurturing parent, to that unity, to that oneness within. The party in the story is unmistakably the messianic banquet, the banquet of reconciliation. It's a celebration filled with people who were once dead and who are now alive. People who lived in the far country and who've now come home. People who have wandered in the wilderness and who've now been brought to the promised land. If that isn't the meaning of salvation, then I don't know what is. The story itself brings us to the threshold of the party, if you remember. We stand at the threshold of our true nature, just like the elder brother. I don't know if he ever went inside to join the party or not. The important question is, what will we do? Will we ever unfold our defiant arms and our bitterness and go in and join the party? The banquet is prepared. Will we join in the joy of our Lord?